Hello, friends of the paranormal. I'm your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this not so cold December day?
I'm doing pretty good. I've been spending the whole afternoon working on the podcast. I hope I have some really cool stories to share.
Excellent. Well, we thank everyone for joining us. If you are first coming, please consider clicking the subscribe button on the platform that you are. Click the like button if you like our content. For those who are coming back, again, thank you for coming back. Click the like as well. I mean, that's really our way of knowing that if we're making things that people like to hear and listen to, other than those who do leave comments, and we do appreciate those as well. If you want to leave a comment, you can do it either on YouTube, Rumble, whatever platform you're on, our Facebook groups. We have our email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com, where you can do that, and we'll keep you anonymous if you wish to be. So with that, what's our topic?
Christmas hauntings. It's getting to that time of year.
It is. Yeah.
So till the time this plays, it'll be just before Christmas. So I thought now is the time.
Perfect.
So if you go back to some of our other years, you're going to hear a lot of the stories about the folklore, about the mythical figures, the Krampus and stuff like that. That isn't really what I wanted to focus on this year. One of the things that I have always found interesting is about the British concept of Christmas is that it's always pretty much gone hand in hand with ghost stories. And we've talked about that in other times, but I did not know until recently that a lot of people in England in the 1800s collected these ghost stories, these Christmas ghost stories and books. And I stumbled across a book by Lord Halifax, whose father had a collection of, they called them their ghost books. And he tells us in this thing from 1936, he tells this little vignette about how as a child he could remember, like near the Christmas weekend or the Christmas time, his parents would, after supper, they'd have the fire going and the candles lit and what have you. And his dad would pull down his ghost book and his mom would say, "Oh, don't do that. You'll scare the children unduly." And he's like, but we were always agog to know, to hear the stories. And we would sit there by the fire and listen and then have to make that long journey up the stairs and down the hall, by our lonesomes to go in. So he talked about it and he saved his father's ghost book and it's been published. You can get it online.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And there's all kinds of archives where it's archived as well, and you can download it for free. And it's Lord Halifax's personal collection, and it was published in the 1930s, as I said. And he says, as long as I can remember, my father's ghost book was one of the most distinctive associations of Hickleton, which is his family's home. He kept it always with great care himself, from time to time making additions in his own handwriting and bringing it out on special occasions, such as Christmas, to read some particular favorites aloud before we all went to bed. I recollect well my mother protesting, although I think almost inevitably to no effect, against the children being frightened too much. The victims themselves were fascinated and spellbound by the series of delicious terror, never failed to ask for more, and so he presented the book for us to enjoy as well. So that said, we're going to kind of wander through the world of ghosts and the spirit of Christmas. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of a fascinating character. I touched on a bunch of these last year, but this was one I didn't. So she's called La Befana. She is from Italy, and La Befana is a Christmas witch, if you will. So the story, there's two legends with her. The first is that she was a very, very tidy housekeeper. And on the way to Bethlehem, the wise men stopped at her home, which, since she's in Italy, seems like it's a little bit out of the way. But according to the legend, that's what happened. So these gentlemen were very appreciative of her hospitality. She fed them and they stayed overnight. And in the morning, they had talked to her what they were doing and told them about the Star over Bethlehem and the baby being born and all this. And they said, "Do you want to come with us?" And she said, no, I have to stay here and keep the house up. And after they had left, she began to rethink that whole thing, because the idea of seeing the Christ child, the Magi, being part of that process just sounded so amazing to her that she rethought it. And she figured she could clean up the cobwebs and dust when she got back. So she started out after them, but she really didn't know where they had gone. So she starts on what she thought was the likely road, the road they started on. And the legend is that she has wandered ever since, through life and now through eternity, looking for the three wise men and to see the Christ child. And along the way, she stops from time to time to rest. And if she finds in a place that she stops that there are very good children, she will leave them with little toys. And if she stops and she finds that there are bad children, she leaves them with onion and garlic and coal.
Right now, I wouldn't mind some onion and garlic and coal.
I'm sure. There is, however, a darker version in which La Befana was actually a mother who lost her child and was driven mad by the loss of her son, her infant son. She hears the story of the birth of Christ and becomes convinced that he is the reincarnation of her own lost child. So she left her home to search for this baby. After looking for months, she found the Holy Family, and she gave the baby Jesus the only things that she had that belonged to her child. And in return, Jesus, or God, blessed La Befana and made her an honorary mother to all of the children of Italy. So her grief healed, she returns. She goes to the homes of the children instead of Santa Claus, and she eats their little snacks, and she delivers to them the goodies, or the not such goodies. But instead of, this is cute, instead of milk and cookies in Italy, they put out a cup of wine and boiled sausages with broccoli, because that's what La Befana prefers. And so that's what she will eat. But there is a caveat to this. If you catch her making a visit on your home on Christmas Eve, don't look up, don't make contact with her eyes, or she will smack you in the face with her witch's broom before leaving without dropping off your toys. So I just thought that was kind of a cute way to start. But it's interesting to me, like if you look up Thanksgiving and ghosts, there's not a whole lot. If you look up Easter and ghosts, there's not a whole lot. But if you look up Christmas and ghosts, oh my, there are reams and reams of stuff. So one of the stories we're going to look at today is the story of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville and his headless dog. So Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville was a political figure. He had the title of Earl of Essex, and he was a prestigious landowner in the 1100s. Because of his title, he had a lot of influence over the royal family and over politics. But there was a intrigue going on, and he picked the wrong side. So whenever his people lost, he gets thrown aside. So the church excommunicates him, because people may not realize it, but the Catholic Church in particular was not really just a religious organization. It was very much a political organization. And if you went against it in any way, they would excommunicate you, and you would either have to pay to be forgiven. And I do mean pay to be forgiven. You could also pay for what they call an indulgence fee, where you could pay for your sin. You could commit a sin and then go pay the priest off, and he would forgive your sin. It was called an indulgence. So they excommunicated him and took his assets. So he lost a lot of his income, his wealth. He was also a soldier, and there were wars going on at the time, conflicts, and he was killed in battle. But because he had been excommunicated, he could not be given a Christian burial. So this is what they believe has trapped his spirit on earth. So the rumor is that the story goes that because he fell, as to his betrayers, somebody who told on him for not supporting the right person financially and politically. His favorite dog was also it was murdered. It was killed. They cut its head off as kind of a cruel thing to do to him, because he was attached to that poor animal. So when he dies, it's 6 years after his death when he appears to the people who betrayed him and his little headless dog. And it's said that he walks across the land in the area that he had owned the land there for his home, wearing a red cloak. And ever since his demise, people claim that they see him on Pym's Brook Bridge in East Barnet in England. There are strange sounds, hazy images of a headless dog rushing through the fog, and Sir Geoffrey walking with his red cloak, taking back in death what was his in life and stolen from him. So he comes on Christmas Eve night only. Now, here's an interesting story that comes from the United States. The story made it into the New York Times, to give you a reference point, and it appeared in 1878, right after the holidays. So basically what was going on is there was a gentleman by the name of Edward Smith who had a home in New York City, and just a couple weeks before Christmas, he started having issues. The doorbell would ring repeatedly throughout the evening and nobody would be there. And at first he thought it was a prank. You know, kids pull pranks, and doorbell dashing was a prank that young people would play, particularly at well-to-do homes, until they got caught and their ears got boxed. And then they found out it wasn't so cool. But, you know, it's just, and that's really what he ascribed it to at the beginning. But then as it got closer to Christmas, this got more intense. And it was all night long. He actually stationed people outside to try to catch him. He had a servant sitting inside the door who could jump up and pull the door open. Nobody saw anything. And now it starts going on day and night. It's just insistent. And then the rocks start getting thrown through the windows. Now it's no longer a prank. Now it's a matter for the police.
Mm-hmm.
So he calls the police, and first one officer comes and he takes it down, and he's like, oh, we'll catch him. We'll put a couple officers outside at night. And, you know, as often as you're saying this is going on, not a problem. So they put an officer or two outside at night, and the stones keep coming through the windows, and the doorbell keeps getting rung, and pounding starts on the side of the house. And the cops see the results of it, hear it, but they don't see any human beings. So eventually there's 4 or 5 officers who are assigned to this, 2 inside, 3 outside. And on their very first night there, almost as a bit of one-upsmanship, whatever this thing was, wailed a brick through the front window right beside the cops.
Ooh, okay. That'll get your attention.
That got theirs, I'm sure. And of course, they immediately look out the window. The officers that are stationed around the house hear the crashing. They do not see anything. This goes on all the way through Christmas night. And then it stops as quickly as it started. It's almost poltergeist-like activity. And, you know, in the article, it tells you that there were no children in this home. You know, there are multiple people stationed outside. This gentleman had his own servants and people he paid to stay outside along with the cops. They had the whole house surrounded, literally. And nobody ever saw anybody, but there's no denying the fact that stones and at least one brick came through, that there was pounding on the side of the house. The cops would hear it and go out to look, and it would still be pounding, but there's nobody there. So it's considered the Christmas poltergeist. And it only happened, I guess, just that one Christmas, but it made the New York Times. So it must have been pretty interesting. So this is a really kind of interesting little story. I found this story where somebody was sharing a story of what happened to them. And it's called The Christmas Church Ghost. And this story takes place in Samoa. This young person who was a child, her family lived in Samoa, and they grew up, and I should say this, her parents grew up in Samoa. They moved away to Australia, but they would come home for the holidays.
Okay.
So the church in Samoa, in the little town that they lived in, which was Satua. I hope I said that right, Satua. And was just a little tiny town, a little tiny church. And like, you know, cousins would all kind of gather around and all the kids would play. Now, the church would be all lit up around Christmas Eve. and the adults would be inside, and the kids went outside to play. It's warm, pleasant, you know, and they're playing basically a game of hide and seek in the cemetery because they still had enough light from the windows of the church to see where they were going. And it was, it was just for fun. And the parents were going to be in the church most of the night because their church services lasted throughout the night. So the kids just kind of, this little girl just sort of follows her cousins, and they all go outside with all the other little kids from the village, and they're playing hide and seek and what have you. And she said, we're hiding down behind the tombstones, and we see the boy who's it coming, but he starts to make a lot of noise. And then he starts yelling, and he takes off running towards the building. Well, unbeknownst to the kids, the parents had gone to another room in the structure where they were getting the meal ready for like a midnight meal.
Okay.
So in the actual chapel area was just this boy who was supposed to be the seeker in the hide and seek game, and then he just didn't show back up. So eventually the kids come crawling out from behind the things they're hiding behind, and they're like, what is going on? He never even found any of us. And they find him unconscious in the sanctuary, laying on the floor. When he comes to, of course, the parents were summoned, and he tells this crazy story about how he saw a little boy go into the church, and he thought it was his brother who had been, was going to stay home because he wasn't feeling well. So he had a grandma or somebody who was watching him, and he thought it was his little brother. So instead of going and finding the other kids in the cemetery, he came into the church to see why his little brother was there. He saw a little boy standing alone at the front of the chapel, but he could only see him from behind, and it still looked very much like his brother. And then when he turned, the boy looked at him, reached out and touched his shoulder, and then just faded away. And it scared the little boy so badly that he passed out. And she said, the woman said in the story, all I can tell you is that it was a Christmas Eve haunting, something I'll never forget. And I've never forgotten this story. And later on, I heard my parents talk about the fact that the little boy had never been in the church, the little brother. He had stayed home with his grandmother, and nobody knew who this child was. So I thought it was an interesting little story. There is a church in England called St. Albans Cathedral, and it has a really interesting history. But we're going to kind of fast forward through its history to 1944. There was a gentleman by the name of Basil Seville. This is World War II in the United Kingdom, and he is on fire watch in the church on Christmas Eve. And so him and a partner are supposed to be watching. You're watching for fires being started. You're watching for lights that you can see because for those who don't know, there were blackouts where you had blackout curtains. You couldn't have lights on because these were things that the enemy soldiers in planes could zero in on, and they would know that there's a village there, and they could drop a bomb on you. So it was vital that you not have these lights. So he was on fire watch inside this church, him and another guy, and they're in separate parts of the building looking in different directions. And says that he heard, as he's sitting there looking out the window, looking around, make sure there's nothing but darkness, he hears the organ playing. And he's like, who is out? We're supposed to be the only people out right now. Because if you're out walking around at night, you could have a light of some sort, then that's going to also be something that they could orient to. So he goes rushing down into the chapel where the organ is, and there's nobody there, but he can hear it. And as he's standing there in the chapel in the half light from the moon, he sees a choir of monks coming into the room, and he says, oh, fathers, I had no idea that other people were here. They look very real to him. They nod, a couple of them speak, and he says, where are you going? And they indicated they were headed to the back of the chapel where there was a private area where they could relax and get something to eat. And he says, I'll walk you there. And he walks them down that direction. And then none of them looked familiar to him. He assumed they were visiting from somewhere else.
Mhm.
And he gets into that area and he has been talking to them on the way, and they sort of got very quiet. And as he turns around, they're gone, just completely gone. And at about that point, his cohort, the other guy who's supposed to be on duty there, comes and finds him and says, "Why are you making all this noise?" And he says, I don't know. And he's like, "Well, why were you playing the organ?" And he's like, "I wasn't." And he said, "Well, who were the people you were leading?" "I watched them from the upstairs window." He saw them too. It is said that ever since then, people go there near Christmas, on Christmas Eve, Christmas night, and they will wait and see if the monks come filing in down the pathway into the church and go inside. The church is now in ruins, but it is still something that some people do. And there have been multiple people who have seen it throughout the years, not just people who knew the story, but like tourists, things like that, people who had no idea what they were about to see. So who these monks were, why they were there, nobody knows. But it made one heck of a tale, I'm sure, to tell afterward.
Mhm.
So we're going to visit Queen Elizabeth II's beloved estate. A lot of these stories are British. That's because there's so many British ghost stories that have been collected through the years. I don't think that's because more British ghosts haunt, but I think they just took a better care of their records on it.
Okay.
So anyhow, the state's called Sandringham, and it is still owned by the royal family. And every year for Christmas, they usually go to this estate in Norfolk, and they have a private period of time where they celebrate their holidays and all of that while everybody's celebrating their holidays. And it is known to be incredibly haunted. There are tons and tons of ghost stories, servants who from way back in history who are seen scurrying around. It gets particularly active at the Christmas season, and I honestly could see that because you can imagine that like that was the time of the hubbub and the bustle, and the queen is coming, and oh, we've got to get it all ready, and you can see the excitement and the energy picking up at that point in time. And they said one of the ghosts there, whoever one of the ghosts there is, the staff talk about the ghost not liking the Christmas cards. They will knock the Christmas cards over if they're sat up. They will, if they're taped or somehow it fixed to a wall or something, they'll tear them down. So they apparently
Okay.
don't like Christmas
Huh.
cards.
Wow.
And they said one of the servants apparently took a little nap in the library and awoke to find books flying off the shelves at him. Voices are heard in the hallways, cold breath on your shoulder or your neck. In 1996, a footman reported to the Queen that he saw the ghost of her favorite servant, a gentleman named Tony Gerard, walking along the cellar of the house as though he were picking wine for Christmas dinner. And the Queen believed him because the person described him so well and had not known him in life. She'd been hired after this gentleman passed away. And it says that the manifestation starts the week before Christmas, and it lasts for about 6 or 7 weeks through the holiday till after the beginning of the new year. And then it firmly just sort of dies off until the holiday season next year. But despite all the
Hmm.
ghosts, or maybe because of it, the family still goes every year for Christmas. Now, another place we're going to visit is Buckingham Palace. So everybody knows Buckingham Palace. We see it. It's on the postcards. It's in all the pictures. But Buckingham Palace is, of course, not the first structure on that ground. At one point, that ground was actually Westminster Abbey, and that's where the monks lived in that. And there is a story about Buckingham Palace, which is kind of fascinating. So, according to local legend, there was a monk who committed some crime or had gone insane, something had happened, and he was housed in one of the small outbuildings outside of the abbey itself, but tended to by the other monks. But here's
Okay.
the proviso. He was chained in that building. And
Hmm.
he is seen behind the palace, at Buckingham Palace, in the general area of where that building would have been, he always appears wearing a brown cloak and rattling his chains on Christmas Eve night. And that's the only time he's seen. But it's been reported for literally eons of time. So there's a church called St. Mary's and All Saints Church in Thirdridge, which is also in England, in Hertfordshire. And they have a church there that the church has a different name as well. It's often referred to as the Frozen Church. And the story is that on Christmas Eve, the families would gather there. And on this one particular Christmas Eve, it was bitterly, bitterly cold. And honestly, everybody would have been better off to stay by their own fires. But not only was it religious, but there was also a political component. So if you didn't show up and the priests knew that, it could be politically disastrous for you. You might not have jobs. You might get spoken against. Bad things could happen. So everybody went. And on that particular night, as it was because it was so bitterly cold, the children were grouped in this one section of the chapel, and several of them froze to death throughout the night. They fell asleep and got quiet, and nobody thought anything of it, and they froze to death. And today there's just ruins of that church that still exist, and a graveyard. And people walking by, particularly around the holiday season, will hear the cries of children. Sometimes they'll even see children playing in the ruins. And if they go up to approach them to say, hey, it's probably not a good idea to be here because it's dangerous, the children will disappear in front of them. And I thought it was just sort of a sad commentary. So the next one is kind of an interesting story. So Charles Dickens, of course, wrote the story, The Christmas Carol, and it is probably one of the biggest reasons he became famous. It caught the imagination of the public. Today, we don't recognize it was a political essay, but it was a political essay. And he was, basically gouging the upper crust for being so careless of everyone else. And after it became a popular book, he began to travel. He made a lot of money off this book, tons and tons of money. And he began to travel across the country, across the world, actually. He was in the United States. He was a lot of different places. And he would read excerpts from his book. And people would pay him like we pay speakers, like, to go around and do these engagements. They paid him very handsomely to do that. So he was in the United States in 1867 doing this. And his favorite place to stay when he was in the United States was a place called the Omni Park House Hotel. And he stayed for a year in this hotel, making it like his linchpin. And he would go there and he had a permanent room for that year. And he would travel out from that and then return back, and they kept the room for him. So this became his favorite place to be. And there's a story that the hotel still exists to this day, by the way. And there are stories that he is seen that used to be seen in a mirror that was in his room. It's now called the Dickens room, as you can imagine. And people will say they hear his voice speaking. They'll see him, but they often saw his reflection in a mirror because Charles Dickens used to stand in front of a mirror and practice his speeches. Now, the mirror has been removed, and it's down the street a little ways in a place called the Tremont Temple Baptist Church. So it sits inside the church now. But the stories of hearing his voice as he's doing recitations of his beautiful book and speaking are still very prevalent, particularly around the Christmas season.
That would scare the dickens out of somebody.
Very funny. So as we come down through this, I wanted to talk about a little bit about a weird Christmas story. So there is a creature called the Julbach. It is a Christmas goat. It's a Scandinavian-themed Christmas trees you see today. You'll see these little straw figures with 4 legs. hanging from the branch, has a little red ribbon around its neck, and it looks like a little donkey or whatever. It's actually a Christmas goat. And the Christmas goat is a good luck decoration today. But the Jewel Box has a long and twisted history. It started out about 1,000 years ago as a reference to Thor and his two pet goats. And one of them was named Taragrinden, which means gapped tooth, and the other one was Tanagorostan, which means tooth grinder. And I love the way the guy says it in this thing. He says, and this is from a book called Spirits of Christmas, The Dark Side of the Holidays by Sylvia Schultz. And so I want to give credit where it's due. She writes, Thor was Petta's worst nightmare. Every night he would slaughter his goats for the warriors' feast in Valhalla. Then he would raise them from the dead the next day to have them around to kill for the next night's feast. His treatment of his pets was commemorated for centuries in a Swedish folk custom called juloffer, or the Yule sacrifice. The ancient midwinter celebration involved an actor dressing in skins and wearing a formidable pair of horns. He was led into the room by two men who pretended to slaughter the goat while singing about it. At the end of the song, the goat jumps up, none the worse for having had his throat slit. The early Christian fathers were not amused by this pagan spectacle, and they declared the Jewel Box to be a demon. The common people took the idea and ran with it. Tales of the 17th century Swedish describe the dark and demonic Jewel Box roaming the countryside on December the 25th, demanding gifts of food and frightening the Christians. By the mid-1900s, though, the Yule sacrifice and the demonic Yule goat have become relics of the past. The Yule goat is now a cheerful little symbol of good luck, and that is how we know him today. So if you happen to be in Europe somewhere and you see that, you'll now know it has a lot of darker history. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is I wanted to kind of end things on a good note, so to speak. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was there's a couple of really interesting stories. There is a story about two gentlemen out in Colorado, and this would have been in the late 1800s. And it was Christmas Eve. There was a horrible blizzard coming. They were trying to drive their cattle back in from the range to get them in where they could, bed them and get them safe for the night. And because, isolated, the cattle would freeze to death. And there's many stories of things like that happening. So these two gentlemen who owned this ranch decided to go out and try to herd the cattle back towards the ranch so they could, get them safe. As the day goes on, the snow is terrible. There's sleet, there's freezing rain, there's ice. These guys are freezing to death, literally. And at some point, they decide that the cattle are going to have to fend for themselves, and they got to head for home, or they're going to die because of the weather. So they start for home. It's really a slow go. The horses are exhausted. You can imagine how terrible it would be trying to walk through those heavy snow drifts with the weight of a human on your back. And so they get a few miles, and then it's getting dark, and the snow is making it hard to see. And to be honest with you, they were getting a little frightened that they might have lost their way because the landmarks are all hidden by the snow. And out of the gloom comes this little structure. It looks like just a single building. It's got a little lean-to attached to it, and it doesn't look like much. It looks abandoned, but it's shelter. And they're not sure how far they are from home. And if they keep going, they could very well freeze to death. Mm-hmm. So they decided the best bet is to pull in there and, put the horses in the lean-to, get them out of the weather, let them rest, and go inside. When they go inside, they realize that it was a bar at some point in its life. There's a bar with a back, of a mirror, and it's all cracked and shattered, and there's nothing in the bar except empty tables and chairs and a fireplace at the far end. So they scout around and they find, some wood, and then they can break up the furniture if necessary throughout the night. They start a fire, and they're sitting there. And the one guy says, I really wish there was at least one bottle left because they're cold and miserable, And a little while later, the other guy says, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I could have swore I heard the sound of a bottle hitting the lip of a glass. And he's like, oh, it's just wishful thinking, dude. And a couple minutes go by, and he says, did you hear that? It sounded like a piano, but like off key, just dong, 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 dong. And he's like, yeah, what is that? And he's like, I don't know. And there's an old busted up piano it couldn't play if it had to. And, they've been kind of scouting around this place looking for stuff to burn, or they're breaking up chair legs and, and shoving stuff in the fire to keep it going. And the fire kind of is building up as they're feeding it. And they realize that there's sounds coming. And then all of a sudden, the sounds start becoming the tinkling of somebody playing music. And now they're really scared. And they sit with their back to the fire and they're watching the room and they're afraid. And they start to see shadows coming out of the walls, just moving, coming up to the bar and walking away. They hear the laughter of a woman and they see the silhouette of what looks like a woman in a dress that comes down over the calves of her legs. And they're terrified, but the storm is still howling. They know they can't find their way in the dark. The horses are still exhausted. They've got to stay put. They can't wait for daylight. And this goes on for quite a while until almost dawn. And then it quietly fades away. And at that point, they look out. The worst of the storm is over. They go check on the horses. The horses are okay. They're hungry and cold, but they're okay. And they get on the horses and they find they were really about 15 miles from home. So they probably would have frozen to death had they not pulled in there to that place and decided to weather the storm out there. And when they get back, of course, it's Christmas Day. And they said they often wondered if this happened every night at this old place or if it was just the Christmas Eve and the celebration of times gone by.
And what happened to the cattle?
All the cattle, I'm sure probably came back. I mean, if they all herded together, they can weather it out. There's lots of stories of, I remember here in Pennsylvania, there's a story about what's called the last buffalo herd in PA. And they were frozen into the ground from the storm. It was literally, the snow was up over their bellies and they couldn't walk it. And they ended up freezing into the ground and they ended up out of mercy, putting them out of their misery. I've read the story a couple different times, written by a gentleman who was part of that group of people that came across the cattle. They came up across them and they found that the cattle were like gagging, and the buffalo rather, and they broke the ice off their noses and they could breathe and they thought they could get them out, but then they realized that they were probably so badly damaged by being frozen into the ground that they would not be able to walk. And it was decided the merciful thing to do was to put them out of this misery. And, there are just so many stories that happen. There's a story about a very vain young lady. And the story goes that this young lady lived in Virginia. And Virginia, the upper mountains of Virginia, get very, very bitterly cold in the winter. And she lived in a rural community. She was not a very well-to-do girl. She had this one dress, though, that was just drop dead. It was her mother had helped her make it. It was beautiful. It was definitely a summer dress. It was made out of silk. It was off the shoulders. It was just really, really beautiful. And she wanted to wear it to the Christmas Eve ball that her boyfriend asked her to. And he showed up, with a wagon, and he has buffalo robes and stuff for her to cuddle under. Her mother kept telling her she needed to put her heavy cloak on and cover up. But if you cover up, nobody sees the pretty dress. So she insisted she was fine. And multiple times on this ride to the place where the ball was going to be, he stopped and he'd say, why don't you just, wrap up in the robes until we get there? Just wrap up in the robe. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. And about 20 minutes before they finally get to their destination, she stops talking. And he feels her head kind of fall over on his shoulder and he smiles. He thinks she's asleep. And when they get to the place, he tries to wake her up to, tell her we're here. And when he reaches out to take her hand, her fingers are frozen. And that's when he realizes that she, for her vanity's sake, had frozen to death. And our last story for the Christmas one is kind of a nice one. It is about a place called Hanging Flat Mine in Derbyshire. In this particular mine, coal mine, there was a tradition that I thought was kind of nice. On Christmas Eve, the miners would leave a half-burned candle, and they would light it and sit it on the rocks. And they did so in memory of an old miner who had died mining in this mine. And the story is that the specter would then, because they left him light on Christmas Eve so he could see, he would protect them from mine collapses for the next year. He would lead them out. They claimed they would see before a mine collapse a single candle lit, held high, and when it went by, that was your cue that you needed to go. My old miner was taking you out of the mine. Something bad was about to happen. And for the next year, he would protect them and keep them safe. It was something that became a symbol of charity and prosperity and a belief of the miners that they might die the year coming if they weren't kind to the old dead miner. And I thought that was a really good story. I have one last story, and it is not a ghost story, and I hope everybody doesn't mind, but it is one of my all-time favorite stories, and I'm hoping to be able to tell it to you. And bear with me just a second as I get it, because I wanted to tell it to you properly. So I pulled up the original version of it. This took place during World War II, and I want to call it a miracle because I think that's exactly what it was. So it's a story of a miracle rather than a story of something else. So during World War II in the Ardennes, there was a group of American soldiers who were fighting the Germans. This is right before Christmas Eve, and there was four Americans and 3 Americans and 4 Germans. They were all stuck in the snow, and it's miserable. It's cold. It's freezing, and they're looking for shelter. They've gotten separated during the battle from their units. And unbeknownst to them, they were headed in the same direction. The 3 Americans, one of whom was slightly injured, saw in the distance a rude cabin, and they were hopeful that these people, whoever they were, would be kind enough to take them in. So they go to the cabin, and there's a woman there and a 12-year-old little boy. And they don't have a whole lot, but she lets them come in and warm up, and she offers them a little bit of the stew that she's made. It's a kind of thin gruel, but it's all she has, and so it's a really kind offer. And they're sitting there eating that little bit of hot stew, which probably tasted better than anything they've ever had in their lives, and being warm, when they hear the pounding on the door and somebody speaks in German. It says, "Let me out, let me in." And the American soldiers know immediately there's German soldiers out there. That's the only answer. And so they grab their guns and they step back into the corner of the shadow. And the woman is like shaking her head and no, don't do this. And she doesn't want this battle in her house. And she opens the door because the Germans are pounding on it insistently. And there's 4 German men standing there, bitterly cold, ice frozen on their clothing. And they say, "Let us in, Fraulein, let us in so we can warm up." And they push past her into the building, and they see the 3 Americans standing there in the shadows with their guns pointed at them. And immediately their guns come up as well. And this woman slams shut the door, and she jumps in between them, and she says, in German, "This is Christ night. How dare you?" And she starts sputtering it off and telling them. One of the Germans could speak a little bit of English, and one of the Americans could speak a little bit of German. So betwixt and between them, they were able to figure out what she was saying. And basically, she was chastising them, and she told them to put the guns down, that there was no war in her home, no war on Jesus' birthday, none. And she said, "Give me the guns." And they gave her the guns, which is a slight miracle in and of itself. And then she offered some more of that stuff she had, that soup, to these German soldiers, and they sat at the table and they ate, and the Americans came over and they sat there with them. And after a few minutes of very awkward silence, glaring at each other, somebody said something about, "Well, we're all here tonight. I guess we make peace." And then they started a kind of conversation with these 2 men trying to help translate. And the woman took out a little bit of flour, and she made a little bit of bread, and she started to bake it. And then when she broke it up into little bites, and she gave every one of them a little piece of it, and her son and herself. And they sat there and they talked and they laughed, and she remembered her husband had a a small bottle of alcohol, and she brought it out, and she gave them each a little bit, and they thanked her. And they toasted Jesus's birth. And when it was all said and done, they all kind of curled up as close as they could get to the fire, and one of them sat up and kept the fire going, and later would tap another one, and he would get up and spend a couple hours feeding the fire so that the Fraulein and her son could sleep, right? And in the morning, they woke up and they looked out, the storm was over, and they looked at each other. They'd broken bread together, literally. And none of them wanted to really kill the other. And finally, the American said, give us 20 minutes head start. And the German, through translation, said, I give you 40. But once we get back to the battlefield, we must be soldiers again, once more. And the American soldier said, I understand. It's the same on our side. We will have to be soldiers once more. And one of the German soldiers said, I pray to God we never see you again, then we don't have to shoot you. And the American said pretty much, yeah, the same thing. And the Fraulein took the guns and handed them to the men as they walked out the door. And they looked at each other and they turned and they walked off. One of the groups went to the barn and they waited. The boy would later write this story. He would come to the United States. He would live in Florida, and he wrote it for a Reader's Digest way back in the early 70s. And he said the Germans sat there for a couple hours waiting for the Americans to get so far ahead they wouldn't have a chance finding them again. And he said, I can't tell you this for sure, but I'm pretty sure the Americans were praying they never got to see them either, because for that one night there was a miracle, and war and bitterness, hatred and anger stopped my mother's kitchen door. And so as we say goodnight to you all and wish you all a very Merry Christmas, may anger and hate, war and evil stop at your door and not come into your homes on this holiday and for the next 100 years. And to quote a wise man, I just want all of the dying and the killing to end. Amen. And with that, good night.